Welcome to A Chapter a Day. Support our channel and subscribe today. Listen carefully, because this may be the most important realization you ever have. Your life is not controlled by your circumstances. It is not controlled by luck. It is not controlled by other people. This goes beyond habits. Here's the deeper realization. Your life is controlled by the image you hold of yourself. Now that sounds simple. But here is what most people never realize. That image is not just influencing your life. It is silently deciding it. Every decision you make, every opportunity you step into or walk away from, every level of success you allow or unconsciously reject, is being filtered through one thing: the identity you have accepted as you. You don't get what you want in life. You get what you believe you are. And here is where it becomes unsettling. Most people never consciously choose that belief. They inherit it. They absorb it. They repeat it. And then they defend it, even when it's the very thing holding them back. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever known exactly what to do and still didn't do it? Have you ever felt ready and then suddenly hesitated for no clear reason? That wasn't confusion. That wasn't lack of discipline. That was your identity protecting itself. Because your mind has one primary function: to keep your life consistent with who you believe you are. Not successful, not fulfilled, consistent. And that means something most people never see. You can want more. You can try harder. You can even work endlessly. But if it conflicts with your identity, you will resist it. Subtly, quietly, repeatedly, until you end up exactly where you started. But here is the shift. If your identity is shaping your life, then changing your identity doesn't just improve things. It rewrites everything. And in this audiobook, you are not just going to hear ideas. You are going to see the hidden structure behind your decisions. You are going to recognize patterns you've been living inside. You are going to understand why you repeat the same cycles, why success can feel unnatural, why change feels harder than it should. And most importantly, how to break the invisible loop that has been defining your life. Because once you see it clearly, you don't just grow. You stop being the person who was stuck, and you become the person who was never limited in the first place. Chapter 1. You are not living your life, you are replaying it. Take a moment and really consider this. What if the life you believe you are living is not as original as it feels? What if, instead of creating your life in real time, you are replaying it? Not consciously, not intentionally, but automatically. Because here is a realization that most people never slow down long enough to see. This isn't your life, it's your loop. And the reason that sounds uncomfortable is because part of you already recognizes it. Think about your past decisions. Not just the big ones, but the small ones. The way you respond under pressure. The way you hesitate when something feels uncertain. The way you move toward what feels familiar, even when it doesn't serve you. Now ask yourself this. How many times have you seen the same pattern? In a different form, different situation, different people, different timing. But somehow, the same outcome, the same hesitation, the same second guessing, the same quiet pull back into what feels known. It almost feels like coincidence, at first, until you notice it happening again, and again, and again. This is the moment where most people say, "That's just how life is." But that explanation is incomplete. Because life is not randomly repeating itself. You are. Let that settle for a second. Because this is where things begin to shift. You are not reacting to life as it happens. You are responding to life through a pre-existing pattern. A pattern that was built over time, reinforced through repetition, and eventually accepted as who you are. And once something becomes part of your identity, it no longer feels like a pattern. It feels like reality. That's why it's so difficult to notice. That's why it's so easy to defend. Because from the inside, it feels true. But here's where it becomes clear. Look at the areas of your life that feel stuck. Not temporarily difficult, but consistently familiar. Maybe it's the way you approach opportunities. You get excited. You consider the possibility. And then something subtle happens. A thought, a hesitation, a quiet voice that says, maybe not right now. Maybe later. Maybe this isn't for you. And just like that, the moment passes. Now here's the question most people don't ask. Was that decision actually based on reality? Or was it based on pattern? Because if you look closely, that same sequence has likely happened before. Different opportunity, same internal response. And that's when you begin to see it. You are not making new decisions. You are repeating familiar ones. This is the loop. And once you see it, you begin to notice it everywhere. In the way people talk about themselves. I've always been like this. I'm just not that type of person. That's not really me. Listen carefully to those phrases. Because they are not observations. They are reinforcements. They are how the loop keeps itself alive. Every time you describe yourself in a fixed way, you make it easier to repeat that behavior again. And over time, repetition becomes identity. And identity becomes limitation. But here's where this gets even more interesting. Because the loop doesn't just repeat failure. It repeats everything. Your level of confidence. Your level of income. Your level of effort. Your level of expectation. It all stabilizes around what feels like you. Which means something most people never fully realize. Even your success is being limited by your identity. Not just your struggles. Let that sink in. Because it changes how you see everything. You're not just repeating problems. You're repeating ceilings. And that's why change feels so difficult. Not because change is hard, but because change is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar means it doesn't match your current identity. So your mind does something subtle. It pulls you back. Not aggressively, not obviously, but just enough to keep you consistent. This is why people can want more, work harder, try again and again, and still end up in the same place. Because effort does not break the loop. Awareness does. You have to see it before you can change it. And right now, you're beginning to see it. You're beginning to recognize that maybe, just maybe, your life has been following a pattern you didn't consciously choose. And that leads to a question that changes everything. If this is a loop, who started it? Was it something you were taught? Something you experienced? Something you repeated until it felt true? Because the moment you ask that question, you separate yourself from the pattern. You stop being the loop, and you start observing it. And that shift is where your power begins. Because you cannot change what you believe is you, but you can change what you can see. So from this moment forward, I want you to start noticing something. Not trying to fix it. Not trying to force change. Just noticing. When you hesitate. When you default to the familiar. When you tell yourself a story about why something won't work. Pause. And ask yourself, is this me, Or is this the loop? Because the more you notice it, the weaker it becomes. And the weaker it becomes, the more space you create for something new. But here's the part most people don't expect. Seeing the loop is only the beginning. Because once you recognize the pattern, you still have to understand what's maintaining it, what's protecting it, what's keeping it in place, even when you want to change. And that brings us to the next realization. Because the loop doesn't exist by accident. It is being reinforced, constantly, by something deeper than behavior. Something more powerful than habit. Something most people never question. Your identity. You've just seen the pattern. You've recognized the repetition. You've realized that what feels like your life may actually be something you've been replaying. But now we go deeper. Because patterns don't survive on their own. They are protected, reinforced, and quietly controlled by the identity you've accepted as yourself. And once you see that, you begin to understand something even more powerful. You are not just living inside a loop. You are living inside a structure you didn't consciously build. And that changes everything. Because if it was built, it can be rebuilt. Let's go deeper. Chapter 2. The Identity Prison You Didn't Know You Built. Take a slow breath and stay with this idea. Because what you are about to see is not obvious at first. In fact, most people live their entire lives without ever noticing it. You are not just experiencing life. You are reflecting it. And more specifically, life is reflecting you. Not the version of you that you show the world, but the version of you that you quietly believe yourself to be. Your assumptions, your expectations, your internal limits, all of it, projected outward, and then experienced as reality. This is what we call the mental mirror. And once you begin to see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because suddenly, things that once felt random start to look patterned. Things that once felt external start to feel connected. And you begin to notice something subtle but powerful. Your life is not just happening around you. It is responding to you. Now think about that for a moment. Not emotionally, not philosophically, practically. Look at the results you are currently experiencing. Your level of income, your level of confidence, the quality of your relationships, the way people respond to you, the opportunities that seem available or unavailable. At first glance, these appear to be separate areas of life, independent, unrelated. But if you look closer, you start to see a pattern of consistency, a range, a ceiling, a kind of invisible boundary, that everything seems to stay within. Maybe your income increases, but only to a certain point. Maybe your confidence grows, but only in certain situations. Maybe your relationships improve, but somehow fall into familiar dynamics. It's subtle, but it's there. And most people never question it. They assume that's just how things are. But here is the realization that changes everything. That boundary is not in your life. It's in your identity. You are not experiencing limits. You are expressing them. Let that settle, because it challenges something deep. It challenges the idea that your environment is the primary force shaping your results. Because if that were true, then why do people in the same environment experience completely different outcomes? Why do two people face the same opportunity and see entirely different possibilities? Why does one person see expansion while another sees risk? The difference is not the situation. The difference is the internal lens. And that lens, is identity. Now here is where it becomes even more revealing, because this reflection is not just occasional. It is constant, ongoing, precise. Life does not randomly mirror you. It reflects you with consistency, which means, if something keeps showing up in your life, it is not coincidence. It is alignment. The way people treat you often aligns with what you believe you deserve. The opportunities you recognize align with what you believe is possible for you. The risks you take align with how you see yourself handling uncertainty. And over time, this creates something that feels very real. A personal version of reality. A world that seems fixed, predictable, defined. But in truth, it is being shaped from the inside out. And here's the part that most people never see. This reflection doesn't just show you who you are. It locks you into it. Because once your external world begins to match your internal identity, it reinforces it. You look at your results, and you say, "See? This is just how things are for me." And that thought becomes more evidence, more reinforcement, more reason to stay the same. This is the identity prison. Not something forced on you, but something formed through repetition. A structure built from beliefs, strengthened by experience, and maintained by confirmation. And the most powerful part of this prison is, it doesn't feel like one. It feels like reality. That's why it's so difficult to break. Because you're not just challenging your thoughts. You're challenging what appears to be proof. But here is the truth beneath that illusion. You're not stuck in life. Life is stuck inside your identity. Your results are not defining you. They are reflecting you. And that means something incredibly important. If the reflection changes, it's because the identity changed first, not the other way around. Now pause here, because this is where many people misunderstand the process. They try to change the reflection. They push for better results. They chase new outcomes. They force external change. But if the identity remains the same, the reflection eventually returns. Maybe temporarily different, but ultimately familiar. Because the mirror doesn't lie. It simply reflects what's in front of it. So the real work is not out there. It's in here. In how you see yourself. In what you believe is natural for you. In what you allow yourself to expect without resistance. Because expectation is not just hope. It is identity in action. And life responds to it accordingly. So now the question becomes, if your world is reflecting your identity, what exactly is it showing you? Not what you wish it showed. Not what you think it should show. But what it consistently shows. Because that consistency is the clue. That's the pattern. That's the structure. And once you see that clearly, you begin to understand something powerful. You don't need to chase a different life. You need to become a different reference point. A different internal standard. A different identity. Because when that changes, the reflection cannot stay the same. It has to adjust. It has to respond. It has to align. And that's when life begins to feel different. Not forced. Not controlled, but naturally expanded. But here's the part most people don't expect. Changing identity is not just about choosing something new. It's about understanding what is currently holding the old identity in place. Because there is a reason this structure feels stable. There is a reason it resists change. There is a reason it keeps pulling you back into the familiar. And that reason is not random. It's built into how your mind works. You've now seen the mirror. You've recognized that your life is not separate from you. It is reflecting you. You've realized that what feels like limitation may actually be alignment with an identity you've been maintaining. But now we go deeper. Because if your identity is shaping your reality, then something must be protecting that identity. Something must be keeping it stable, even when you want to change it, even when you try to outgrow it. And here is where it becomes surprising, because the very system you rely on to succeed may be the same system keeping you the same. Let's uncover it. Chapter 3. Your brain is not designed to make you successful. Stay with this, because what you are about to hear may challenge something you've believed your entire life. Most people assume that their mind is working in their favor, helping them grow, helping them succeed, helping them move forward. But what if that assumption is incomplete? What if your mind is not actually designed to make you successful? What if its primary goal is something entirely different? Not growth, not expansion, not even happiness, but stability, consistency, predictability. Now pause and think about that, because it explains something most people struggle to understand. Why you can want something deeply and still resist it. Why you can see an opportunity clearly and still hesitate. Why you can be capable, ready, even excited, and then suddenly feel off, uncertain, pulled back. And in that moment, it feels like something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. Something is working exactly as it was designed to. Because your brain has one main priority: to keep your internal world predictable, to keep your identity consistent, to make sure that what you experience matches what you expect. And that means something very important. Your brain is not asking, "Is this better?" It is asking, "Is this familiar?" And if the answer is no, it creates resistance, not as punishment, but as protection. Now this is where the realization becomes powerful, because most people interpret that resistance incorrectly. They feel discomfort and assume, "This must not be right." They feel uncertainty and conclude, "I'm not ready." They feel doubt and believe, "This probably won't work." But in reality, they are not responding to the opportunity itself. They are responding to its unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity is what the brain is designed to avoid. This is why growth feels uncomfortable. Not because growth is dangerous, but because growth is new. And new means unpredictable. And unpredictable does not match your current identity. So your brain does something subtle. It creates a sense of misalignment, a feeling that something is off. And that feeling is enough to stop most people. Let's make this real. Imagine an opportunity appears in your life. Something bigger than what you're used to. More responsibility, more visibility, more potential. At first, you feel excitement. You think, "This could change things." But then, something shifts. You start analyzing, questioning, doubting. Am I ready for this? What if I fail? What if this doesn't work out? And slowly, that initial excitement fades, replaced by hesitation. And eventually, you step back. Now from the outside, it looks like a reasonable decision. Logical, careful, even responsible. But underneath that logic, there is something deeper happening. Your identity and the opportunity did not match. And your brain chose identity, because identity is predictable. And predictability is what it protects. This is why people reject opportunities that could change their life. Not because they can't handle them, but because they don't feel like the kind of person who does. Let that sink in, because it changes how you interpret everything. It means that discomfort is not a warning sign. It is a signal that you are stepping outside of your current identity, a signal that you are moving beyond what feels familiar, a signal that something is changing. But here is the part that most people never fully accept. Your mind would rather keep you the same than help you win. Not because it wants you to fail, but because the same feels safe. Even if that same includes limitation. Even if that same includes frustration. Even if that same includes repeating the same patterns over and over again. Because from the brain's perspective, familiar struggle is better than unfamiliar success. And once you see that, you stop taking resistance personally. You stop interpreting hesitation as weakness. You stop assuming that discomfort means you're on the wrong path. Instead, you begin to see it for what it is: a natural response to identity expansion. Now think about how much this changes. Because now, when you feel that hesitation, you don't automatically pull back. You pause. You observe. You ask, is this actually wrong, or is this just unfamiliar? And that question alone begins to shift your behavior, because it creates space. Space between feeling and reaction. Space between impulse and decision. And in that space, you gain something powerful: choice. The ability to act beyond your conditioning. The ability to move forward, even when it doesn't feel natural yet. And that is where growth truly begins. Not when things feel easy. Not when things feel certain. But when you move forward, despite the unfamiliarity. Because every time you do that, you send a new signal to your mind. You begin to teach it something different. You begin to show it. This is safe too. This is possible too. This can be part of who I am. And slowly, what once felt uncomfortable becomes normal. What once felt distant becomes natural. What once felt impossible becomes expected. That is how identity shifts. Not through force, but through repeated exposure to the unfamiliar, until it becomes familiar. And when that happens, the resistance disappears. Not because the opportunity changed, but because you did. Now pause here, because this leads to another realization. If your brain is constantly working to keep you consistent, then it must also be doing something else. Something subtle, something automatic, something that reinforces your current identity every single day. Not through big decisions, but through small, repeated patterns. Thoughts you don't question, stories you keep telling yourself, labels you continue to accept. And those patterns are what quietly shape your behavior over time. You now understand something most people never fully see. Your brain is not designed to make you successful. It is designed to keep you consistent, to keep you predictable, to keep you aligned with the identity you've been living in. And that means, every time you try to grow, you will feel resistance. Not because you are incapable, but because you are becoming unfamiliar to yourself. But now we go deeper. Because if your mind is protecting your identity, then there must be a mechanism reinforcing that identity every single day. A process so subtle, you rarely notice it happening, yet so powerful. It shapes who you believe you are. And once you see it, you begin to understand why change feels slow. Even when you're trying. Let's uncover it. Chapter 4. The lie of "this is just who I am." Listen carefully, because this is where one of the deepest illusions begins to break. At some point in your life, You said something about yourself, and then you repeated it. Maybe it sounded like this: I'm just not confident. I've always been this way. I'm not the type of person who. And it felt true. Not because you examined it, not because you proved it, but because you experienced it repeatedly. And that repetition created something powerful. A pattern that began to feel like identity. Now here's where it gets interesting. Your mind does something subtle, but incredibly important. It takes what you do often and turns it into who you are. Not because it's accurate, but because it's efficient. Think about that for a moment. The brain is constantly trying to simplify reality. It doesn't want to analyze every behavior from scratch. So it creates shortcuts. Labels. I am this. I am not that. And once a label is formed, it begins filtering your behavior. Pause for a moment and think about this. How many things you believe about yourself started as a single repeated action? Not a truth. Not a permanent trait. Just something you did often enough that your mind decided to name it. Here's the pattern most people never notice. You act. The mind label. Then the label controls the next action. And slowly, the pattern reinforces itself. Let's make this real. Imagine someone who hesitated a few times in social situations. Maybe they felt uncomfortable. Maybe they avoided speaking up. After a few repetitions, a thought appears. I'm shy. Now notice what happens next. That person enters a new situation, and instead of responding freely, they consult the label. I'm shy. So they act accordingly. They hold back. They stay quiet. They reinforce the pattern. And now the illusion deepens. Because it feels consistent. It feels predictable. It feels real. But here's the truth that changes everything. You are not discovering yourself. You are practicing yourself. Let that settle. You are not uncovering some fixed identity buried inside you. You are rehearsing patterns, and then calling them who you are. Here's something strange about how the mind works. It doesn't question what is familiar. It defends it, even if that familiarity is limiting, even if it's holding you back, even if it's painful. Because to the mind, familiar equals safe. And identity is built on familiarity. So when you say, "This is just who I am," what you often saying is, "This is what I've practiced the most." Now here's where the shift begins. If identity is practiced, then it can be repracticed. If it was built through repetition, it can be rebuilt the same way. But this is where most people hesitate. Because changing behavior feels uncomfortable, and that discomfort gets misinterpreted. People think, "This doesn't feel like me." But that's not a warning. That's evidence. Think about this for a moment. Of course it doesn't feel like you. It's new, and your current identity is built on what is familiar. So anything outside of it will feel foreign at first. This is where the pattern recognition trigger becomes powerful. Start noticing your own labels. Not judging them. Not fighting them. Just noticing. I always procrastinate. I'm bad with money. I'm not disciplined. Now pause and ask yourself, how many times did I practice that before I decided it was true? Because once you see it as practice, it loses its permanence. And once it loses permanence, it becomes changeable. Here's the deeper layer most people never reach. Your identity is not a fixed truth. It is a reinforced story. A story written by repetition, maintained by familiarity, protected by your mind. And that means something powerful. You don't need to become a new person. You need to start practicing a new pattern. Now listen closely. The next time you catch yourself saying, "This is just who I am," interrupt it. Not aggressively, not forcefully. Just notice it. And then ask, "Is this who I am? Or is this what I've repeated?" That question creates space. And in that space, you gain power. Because now, instead of acting automatically, you begin choosing consciously. And at first, it will feel small. Subtle shifts. Slightly different decisions. Moments where you act just a little outside the pattern. But those moments matter. Because each one is a vote. Not for who you were, but for who you are becoming. Let's go deeper. Every time you act differently, even in a small way, you introduce a new pattern. And patterns, when repeated, become identity. So the real question is not, "Who am I?" The real question is, "What am I practicing?" Because your future self is being built right now, not through big declarations, but through repeated behavior. And this is where most people miss the opportunity. They wait to feel different before acting different. But it works the other way around. You act different, and then you begin to feel different. You repeat the new pattern, and then the identity begins to shift. So when it feels unnatural, good, that means you are no longer reinforcing the old pattern. That means something new is being introduced. Pause again, and really think about this. What part of your identity have you been treating as permanent, that might actually just be practiced? Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you stop accepting it automatically. And that is the moment the loop begins to weaken. Not because you force change, but because you question the illusion. You didn't find yourself. You practiced yourself. And now, you can practice something new. And once you begin to see identity as something you practice, rather than something you are, a deeper question emerges. If your identity is built through repetition, then what is actually driving those repetitions? What is the invisible force behind the choices you make again and again, without even realizing it? Because there is something underneath the pattern, quietly influencing every decision. And once you see it, you begin to understand your behavior in a completely different way. Chapter 5. The invisible force behind every decision you make. Slow down for a moment, because this is where things become very precise. Up until now, you've started to see the pattern. You've recognized the loop. You've seen how identity shapes your reality. You've understood that your mind protects what feels familiar. But now we go deeper, because all of that leads to one central mechanism. One invisible force that is quietly directing your life in real time. Your decisions. Not just the big ones. Not just the obvious ones. But the small, constant, almost unnoticed decisions that you make every single day. What to say. What to avoid. What to attempt. What to delay. What to believe. And here is the realization that changes everything. Your decisions are not primarily logical. They are not neutral. They are not purely rational. They are identity confirmations. Every single one. Now that may sound subtle, but it's powerful. Because it means when you make a decision, you are not just choosing an action. You are reinforcing a version of yourself. You are answering a deeper question. Who am I? And your behavior becomes the evidence. Think about that carefully, because it explains something most people struggle with. why they know what to do and still don't do it, why they understand the right move and still choose something else. It's not a lack of information. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's alignment. Alignment with identity. Because if a decision does not match who you believe you are, it will feel unnatural to make, even if it's the right decision, even if it would move your life forward. Let's make this real. Imagine someone is on the edge of a breakthrough. An opportunity appears. A chance to step into something bigger. More visibility. More responsibility. More growth. And for a moment, they feel it. The possibility. The excitement. The sense that this could change everything. But then, something happens. A subtle shift. A quiet hesitation. A thought that sounds reasonable. What if I'm not ready? What if this doesn't work? What if I mess this up? And slowly, they pull back. They delay. They overthink. They hesitate just long enough for the opportunity to pass. Now from the outside, it looks like fear, or uncertainty, or bad timing. But underneath, something much more specific is happening. Their decision did not match their identity. And in that moment, their mind chose identity over expansion, because maintaining a consistent self-image feels more important than stepping into something new. This is what self-sabotage actually is. Not destruction, not failure, but protection. Protection of the identity you've been living with. Even if that identity is limiting you. Even if that identity is outdated. Even if that identity no longer reflects what you want. Because your mind is not asking, will this improve my life? It is asking, does this match who I believe I am? And if the answer is no, it creates friction, hesitation, doubt, delay. And most people interpret that friction as a sign to stop. But now you see it differently. Now you recognize it as a signal. A signal that you are approaching the edge of your current identity. Now here is where the shift becomes powerful. Because once you understand this, you stop focusing only on the decision itself, and you start paying attention to what the decision represents. Because every decision is doing something deeper. It is casting a vote for the person you believe you are, or the person you are becoming. And that means something incredibly important. Every choice is a vote for who you think you are. Not occasionally, not sometimes, always. When you hesitate, you vote for the identity that avoids risk. When you speak up, you vote for the identity that expresses confidence. When you delay, you vote for the identity that stays in the familiar. When you act, you vote for the identity that moves forward. And over time, those votes accumulate. They reinforce patterns. They strengthen beliefs. They build identity, not through one big decision, but through thousands of small ones. And eventually, that identity feels real, stable, fixed. But now you know the truth. It was built, which means it can be rebuilt. Now pause here, because this is where your awareness becomes practical. This is where everything you've learned begins to turn into action. From this point forward, I want you to notice your decisions differently. Not just what you're choosing, but what that choice is reinforcing. When you feel hesitation, don't just ask, "What should I do?" Ask, "What identity is this decision supporting?" Because that question changes everything. It shifts your focus from outcome to alignment. It forces you to become aware of the version of yourself you are strengthening. And once you see that clearly, You gain the ability to choose differently. Not based on comfort. Not based on habit. But based on intention. Now this doesn't mean every decision becomes easy. It doesn't mean resistance disappears immediately. Because remember, your mind is still trying to keep things consistent. But now, you are no longer unconscious of that process. You can feel the pull and still move forward. You can notice the hesitation and still act. You can hear the old patterns and choose not to follow them. And every time you do that, you cast a new vote. A vote for a different identity. A vote for expansion. A vote for change. And slowly, that new identity begins to take shape. Not through force, but through repetition. Through consistency. Through alignment between who you say you want to be and how you actually behave. Now here is the deeper realization. You don't become someone new all at once. You become someone new. Decision by decision. Moment by moment. Choice by choice. And the more those choices align with a new identity, the more natural it begins to feel. Until one day, what once required effort feels automatic. What once felt uncomfortable feels normal. What once felt impossible feels like you. That is how transformation actually happens. Not through a single breakthrough, but through accumulated alignment. Now take a moment and think about the last few decisions you've made. Not just what you chose, but what those choices reinforced. Because that pattern is showing you something. It's showing you who you've been voting for. And now, you have the ability to change your vote. You've now uncovered something most people never fully realize. Your decisions are not random. They are not purely logical. They are reflections of identity. And every choice you make is reinforcing a version of yourself. Which means, if you want to change your life, you don't just change your actions. You change the identity behind those actions. But now we go even deeper. Because once you begin making different decisions, once you start stepping outside the familiar, something inevitable happens. Something that most people misunderstand. Something that causes many to stop. Right before real change begins. You feel discomfort. Not mild discomfort, but a deeper sense that something is off. And most people interpret that feeling as a problem. But what if it's not? What if that discomfort is actually the signal that you're moving in the right direction? Let's explore that. Chapter 6. Why your future feels uncomfortable, and that's the signal. Stay with this, and don't rush past it. Because what you're about to understand will change how you interpret one of the most powerful signals in your life. Discomfort. Most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid it. They move away from it. They interpret it as a warning. They treat it as a sign that something is wrong. But what if that interpretation is backwards? What if discomfort is not a signal of danger, but a signal of expansion? What if the very feeling you've been avoiding is the exact indicator that you are moving beyond the limits of your current identity? Now pause and think about that, because it explains something most people have experienced, but never fully understood. Moments where you were on the edge of something new, and suddenly, you felt resistance. Not physical resistance. Not something you could point to, but a feeling, a tightening, a hesitation, a subtle sense that something isn't quite right. And in that moment, most people step back. They interpret that feeling as a stop sign. They tell themselves, "This doesn't feel right. This might not be for me. I should wait until I feel more ready." But here is the truth that changes everything. That feeling isn't telling you to stop. It's telling you that you've reached the edge of your current identity. Because your future, by definition, is unfamiliar. It has to be. If it felt completely natural, it wouldn't be new. It would just be a continuation of what you've already been doing. So when you begin to move towards something different, something bigger, something outside your current pattern, your mind reacts. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's unknown. And unknown is what your mind is designed to resist. Now let's make this real. Think about a time when you were closest to growth. Maybe it was an opportunity you almost took, a conversation you almost had, a decision you almost made. And right before that moment, you felt something. Not clarity, not confidence, but tension, uncertainty, a quiet voice that said, "Are you sure about this?" That moment was not weakness. It was not lack of readiness. It was proximity to change. Because when you are about to step into something that does not match your current identity, your system reacts. It tries to pull you back. Not forcefully, but subtly. Through feeling, through emotion, through doubt. And most people trust that feeling. They assume it's guidance. But what they are actually doing is reinforcing their current identity. Because every time you step back from the unfamiliar, you confirm something internally. This is not me. And that confirmation strengthens the boundary, keeps the identity intact, maintains the loop. But here is where everything shifts. Because once you understand what discomfort actually is, you stop fearing it. You stop avoiding it. And you start using it. Because now, when you feel that hesitation, you don't immediately retreat. You pause. You observe. You ask yourself, is this actually wrong, or is this just new? And that question alone begins to change your relationship with growth. Because now, you recognize something powerful. If it feels unfamiliar, you're finally moving. Let that settle. Because it flips everything. It means that the feeling you once avoided is now a signal to lean in. It means that the moment you feel uncertain is the moment you're stepping beyond your past. It means that discomfort is not the enemy. It is the doorway. Now this doesn't mean you ignore all signals. It doesn't mean you act recklessly. But it does mean you stop using discomfort as your primary decision-making tool. Because discomfort is not designed to guide you toward your future. It is designed to keep you consistent with your past. And if you follow it blindly, you will continue repeating what you already know. So the shift becomes this. Instead of asking, "Does this feel comfortable?" you begin asking, "Does this move me beyond who I've been?" And that question changes everything. Because it aligns your decisions, not with familiarity, but with growth. Now here is something even deeper. Discomfort doesn't just appear randomly. It appears in proportion to the size of the identity shift. The bigger the change, the stronger the resistance. The more unfamiliar the step, the more intense the feeling. Which means, if something feels significantly uncomfortable, it may also be significantly important. Not always, but often. Because your system is reacting to the magnitude of the shift. Now think about how this reframes your past. Moments you walked away from, decisions you didn't take, opportunities you hesitated on. What if those weren't wrong choices, but misinterpreted signals? What if you were closer than you thought, but stepped back because it didn't feel right? And now, you begin to see it differently. Not with regret, but with awareness. Because that awareness changes your future decisions. From this point forward, when discomfort appears, you recognize it. You don't immediately trust it. You don't immediately obey it. You examine it. You question it. You use it as information, not instruction. And in doing so, you begin to move differently. You begin to act beyond your conditioning. You begin to step into spaces that once felt inaccessible, not because they've changed, but because your relationship with them has. And over time, something remarkable happens. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The uncomfortable becomes normal. The identity expands. And what once felt like growth starts to feel like you. That is the process. Not sudden transformation, but gradual normalization of a new identity. And it all begins with how you interpret discomfort. Now take a moment and think about where in your life you've been feeling that signal, where something feels slightly off, slightly uncertain, slightly outside your usual pattern, because that might not be something to avoid. It might be something to step into. You've now redefined something most people misunderstand. Discomfort is not danger. It is expansion. It is the signal that you are moving beyond the limits of your current identity. And if you learn to recognize it, instead of retreating from it, you begin to move differently. You begin to grow intentionally. But now we go even deeper. Because once you start stepping into the unfamiliar, once you begin moving beyond your patterns, a realization begins to surface. A realization that can feel both empowering and unsettling at the same time. You begin to see something clearly, something that was always there, but never fully acknowledged. That many of the limits you believed were external were never external at all. And that realization changes how you see your past. Let's explore that. Chapter 7. The moment you realize you've been holding yourself back. Take a breath and stay present with this. Because this chapter is not just about understanding something new. It's about seeing something differently. Something that has always been there, but never fully acknowledged. There comes a moment in this process, a quiet, almost unsettling moment, where everything begins to reframe. Not your future, your past. You start to look back at decisions you made, opportunities you didn't take, moments where something could have changed, and instead of seeing confusion or bad timing, you begin to see a pattern, a very specific pattern, and it leads to a realization that can feel uncomfortable at first, but incredibly freeing once you accept it. There was no external force stopping you. Not truly. Not consistently. Not in the way you once believed. Now that doesn't mean life didn't present challenges. It doesn't mean circumstances didn't exist. But it does mean this. The limits that felt external were often internal. Filtered through identity. Interpreted through belief. Reinforced through repetition. And once you begin to see that, something shifts. Because you're no longer looking at your past through the lens of what happened to you. You're looking at it through the lens of, how did I show up within it? And that question changes everything. Because now, moments that once felt out of your control start to look different. Let's go back for a moment. Think about an opportunity you didn't take. Something that could have moved your life forward. At the time, it may have felt unclear, uncertain, maybe even impossible. But now, with what you understand, look at it again. Was it truly impossible? Or did it simply not match who you believed you were at that time? Because those are not the same thing. And that distinction is where the realization happens. Because when you see that clearly, you understand something most people avoid. You weren't blocked. You were aligned. Aligned with a version of yourself that wasn't ready to step into something different. Not because you lacked ability, not because you lacked opportunity, but because you lacked identity alignment. And your decisions reflected that. Now this is where it becomes powerful. Because at first, this realization can feel heavy. You may think, so I've been the one holding myself back this whole time? And the answer is, yes. But not consciously. Not intentionally. You weren't choosing to limit yourself. You were choosing consistency. You were choosing what felt like you. And at the time, that made sense. Because that's how your mind is designed. To keep you aligned with your identity. To keep your actions predictable. To keep your experience consistent. So this is not about blame. It's about clarity. Because once you remove blame, you gain something much more useful. Responsibility. And responsibility is where your power begins. Because now, if your past was shaped by identity alignment, then your future can be shaped the same way. But consciously, deliberately, intentionally. Now let's go deeper. Because this realization doesn't just apply to missed opportunities. It applies to patterns, repeated experiences, situations that seem different on the surface, but feel familiar underneath. Maybe it's the way you approach challenges. You start strong, then slowly pull back. Maybe it's the way you handle uncertainty. You consider action, then default to hesitation. Maybe it's the way you see yourself in certain environments. Capable in some, restricted in others. At first, these seem like separate experiences. But now you see the connection. They were all expressions of the same identity, the same internal structure, the same version of you, showing up consistently. And that's why the results felt consistent. Now here's the shift. Because once you see this pattern clearly, you can no longer fully believe the old story. The story that says, I was just unlucky. It wasn't the right time. That's just how things are for me. Those explanations begin to lose their hold. Because you see what was underneath them. Alignment, consistency, identity. And this is where the transformation deepens. Because now, when a new opportunity appears, you don't just evaluate the situation. You evaluate yourself within it. You ask, am I about to respond from who I've been? Or from who I am becoming? And that question creates a break in the pattern. A pause. A moment of awareness. And in that moment, you are no longer reacting automatically. You are choosing. And that choice is where everything begins to change. Now here is the most important part of this realization. You were not stuck. You were not blocked. You were not limited. You were aligned with a smaller version of yourself. Let that settle. Because it reframes everything. It means your potential was always there. Your opportunities were often there. Your ability was there. But your identity was calibrated to something smaller. Something more familiar. Something more predictable. And your life followed that calibration. Perfectly. But now, that calibration is no longer fixed. Because you see it. And once you see it, you can change it. Not instantly. Not all at once. But progressively. Through awareness. Through different decisions. Through intentional alignment with something new. Now take a moment and reflect on this honestly. Not critically. Not emotionally. Just clearly. Where in your life Have you been operating from a smaller version of yourself? Where have you been playing within limits that felt real, but were actually internal? Because that awareness is not meant to discourage you. It's meant to show you something powerful. If you were the one maintaining the limitation, you are also the one who can move beyond it. And that is not pressure. That is freedom. You've now reached one of the most important realizations in this entire process. You were not being held back by the outside world. You were being held in place by alignment with an identity that no longer serves you. And once you see that, you stop waiting for conditions to change. You stop looking for external permission. You begin to understand that change starts within. But now we move into something even more practical. Because awareness alone is not enough. Seeing the pattern is powerful, but breaking it requires something more. A moment, a decision, an action taken in real time, when the pattern is trying to repeat itself. Because that is where change actually happens. Not later, not eventually, but in the exact moment you would normally do the same thing again. Let's step into that. Chapter 8: Breaking the Loop in Real Time. Now, this is where everything becomes real. Up until this point, you've been observing, recognizing, understanding. You've seen the loop. You've understood identity. You've realized how your mind protects what feels familiar. But now we move into something different. Because awareness, by itself, does not create change. It creates possibility. But possibility only becomes reality in a moment, a very specific moment. The moment where you are about to do what you've always done. That moment is everything. Because that is where the loop either continues or breaks. And most people miss it. Not because they don't want to change, but because the moment happens quickly, quietly, almost automatically. A thought appears, a feeling follows, a decision forms, and before they realize it, they've repeated the pattern again. But now, you're going to begin seeing that moment differently. Because once you recognize it, you can interrupt it. Not later, not after the fact, in real time. And that is the only place where change actually happens. Let's slow this down so you can see it clearly. A situation appears. Something familiar, in structure, even if it looks new. An opportunity, a challenge, a decision point. And almost instantly, your mind begins to respond. Not consciously, automatically. Based on your identity, you feel something. Maybe hesitation, maybe doubt, maybe the pull to delay or avoid. And right there, that's the moment. That's the edge. That's where the loop is about to repeat itself. Now in the past, that moment passed unnoticed. You felt the hesitation, and you followed it. You assumed it meant something. You trusted it, and your behavior aligned with it. But now, something is different. Now you see it. Now you notice the pattern as it's happening. And that awareness creates a pause, a small gap. But that gap is powerful, because inside that gap, you are no longer automatic. You are conscious. You are aware. You are choosing. And that is where the loop can break. Not through force, not through motivation, but through a single, deliberate shift. You do not follow the pattern. That's it. Simple in concept, powerful in execution. Because the loop depends on repetition. It survives by being followed. So the moment you don't follow it, something changes. Immediately. The loop breaks the moment you don't follow it. Let that sink in. Because it removes complexity. It removes the idea that change requires something massive, something dramatic, something external. It doesn't. It requires a different response, in a familiar moment. Now let's make this real. You're about to do something you've been putting off. Something small, but meaningful. And as you approach it, you feel that familiar hesitation. The thought appears, I'll do this later. That's the pattern. That's the loop. Now in the past, you would have followed it. You would have delayed. And that delay would have reinforced the identity. But now, you notice it. You recognize the thought. And instead of accepting it, you pause. And you ask yourself, is this the loop, or is this me choosing? And in that moment, you have a decision to make. Not about the task, but about your identity. Because if you follow the hesitation, you reinforce the old pattern. But if you act, even slightly, even imperfectly, you create something new. A different signal, a different outcome, a different version of yourself. And that's how change actually happens. Not through perfection, not through consistency at first, but through interruption, breaking the pattern, one moment at a time. Now here is something important to understand. This will not feel natural at first. It will feel forced, uncomfortable, even slightly unnatural, because you are acting outside of your current identity. And your system will notice that. It will try to pull you back. But that's expected. That's part of the process. Because every time you interrupt the pattern, you weaken it. And every time you choose differently, you strengthen something new. And over time, that new pattern becomes easier, more natural, more automatic, until eventually, it becomes your default. Now here is where this becomes powerful on a larger scale. Because this doesn't just apply to small moments. It applies to everything. The way you speak, the way you think, the way you respond, the way you show up in your life. Every pattern can be interrupted. Every loop can be broken. But only in the moment it's happening. Not before, not after. During. That's why awareness is so important. Because without it, the moment passes unnoticed, and the pattern continues. But with it, you begin to catch yourself. Earlier, more often, more clearly, and those small interruptions start to compound. They start to shift your behavior. They start to reshape your identity. And eventually, they start to change your results. Not all at once, but steadily, consistently, naturally. Now pause for a moment and think about this practically. Where in your life do you notice the same pattern repeating? Where do you feel that familiar hesitation? That automatic response? That predictable reaction? Because the next time it appears, that's your moment. Not to think differently, not to plan differently, but to act differently, even slightly, even imperfectly, because that action is what breaks the loop. And once the loop begins to break, your identity begins to shift. And once your identity begins to shift, your entire life starts to follow. You've now seen where real change happens. Not in theory, not in intention, but in the moment of decision. You've realized that the loop doesn't control you. It only continues when you follow it. And the moment you choose differently, it begins to break. But now we move into something even more powerful. Because breaking the loop is only the beginning. Once you interrupt the old pattern, you create space. And that space must be filled with something new. A new way of thinking, a new way of acting, a new way of seeing yourself. Because if you don't define it, the old identity will slowly return. So the next step is not just breaking the loop. It's becoming someone new. Not gradually, but intentionally. Let's explore that. Chapter 9. Becoming someone your past can't recognize. Now, lean in slowly and let this sink deep. Because what you are about to understand will change the way you think about yourself forever. Up until now, we've been tracing the loop. We've seen how identity shapes every choice. We've discovered how hesitation and discomfort are signals, not roadblocks. We've even learned how to break the loop in real time. But breaking the loop is just the first step. Stopping an old pattern only leaves a space. And that space is where transformation lives. The question now becomes, who are you going to become in that space? Most people wait for proof. They wait to feel ready. They wait for confidence to arrive. And by doing that, they allow their old identity to sneak back in. Their past self quietly reasserts control. They fall back into the same patterns, the same hesitation, the same small self. But the truth is this: you don't wait to become someone new. You act first, and the acting creates the identity. Pause. Let that resonate. Because it's counterintuitive. The mind wants to feel ready first. It wants evidence. It wants certainty. But identity never follows certainty. Identity follows action. Identity is upgraded the moment you behave differently. Before the world confirms it. Before your feelings catch up. Before the past even recognizes it. Let's make this practical. Imagine the person you want to be. Not some vague idea. Not a distant version of yourself. The person who steps forward, even when it's uncomfortable. The person who seizes opportunities, even when fear is present. The person who thinks, speaks, and acts as if success is already theirs. Now imagine acting like that person. Today. Right now. Even if it feels unnatural. Even if it feels forced. Because here's the secret. The unnatural action is the signal to your mind. It tells your system, this is who I am becoming. And over time, those small, deliberate actions accumulate. They reshape your perception. They reshape your behavior. They reshape the way the world sees you. Let's put it in real-world terms. A person who wants to be confident doesn't wait until they feel confident. They act confident in meetings, in conversations, in public. They hold themselves differently. They speak differently. They walk differently. And slowly, the feeling of confidence catches up to the behavior. The person who wants to be financially disciplined doesn't wait for the perfect financial situation to feel responsible. They start making disciplined choices now. Even small ones. Even unseen ones. And over time, the identity of a disciplined person grows naturally from the behavior. And this is the loop that matters, the identity upgrade loop. Action precedes feeling. Behavior precedes belief. The new you precedes recognition. Now here's a reflection for you. What would feel unnatural, but necessary, if you were willing to step into it today? Because whatever feels slightly uncomfortable now is probably exactly what your future self needs to become. This is where most people fail. They wait for certainty. They wait for comfort. They wait for the past to approve. But the new version of you doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for approval. It doesn't check the scoreboard before showing up. It simply acts. And in acting, the mind catches up. The feelings adjust. The identity shifts. And eventually, your past self looks back and says, "Who is this? This isn't me." This isn't the person I've known. Who are you? And that is the power of deliberate transformation. To become someone your past can't recognize. To live in a new orbit, where the loops of yesterday no longer define you. And as you take these actions, one decision, one moment, one step at a time, the world begins to respond. Opportunities align, energy flows differently, and your new self takes root, not as a theory, not as a wish, but as a living, breathing identity. You've now reached one of the most profound stages in this journey. You've broken the loops. You've stepped into real-time awareness. You've begun upgrading your identity before evidence appears. And now, it's time to see the bigger picture. Because transformation is not just personal. It's expansive. It's philosophical. It's about designing the life you want, intentionally. And that is the final phase. Chapter 10. You were never limited, only repeating. Take a deep breath and let yourself fully arrive here. Because this chapter is the culmination of everything you've been learning. Everything you've been seeing, noticing, interrupting, and acting on. It all comes together now. Most people live their entire lives believing that limitations are real. That external circumstances hold them back. That luck, opportunity, timing, or other people are the primary determinants of success. But here's the truth, the shocking, liberating truth. The limit was never real, only repeated. Every hesitation you've felt, every "I can't" you've whispered silently to yourself, every decision you made that kept you small, was the loop of your identity repeating itself. And once you understand that, everything changes. Because limits, by definition, are external only if you accept them internally. If your identity shifts, if the mental model of who you are evolves, then the supposed barriers vanish. Almost instantly. Think back over this journey. You noticed your loops. You saw how identity shapes every choice. You understood that discomfort signals growth, not danger. You began breaking the loop in real time. You started acting like a version of yourself that your past couldn't recognize. And now, everything aligns. Here is the remarkable part. Life doesn't wait for conditions to be perfect. Life doesn't need circumstances to change first. The opportunities, the clarity, the energy, they appear as a reflection of your identity. Your external world is a mirror, and the reflection only shifts when you shift first. Pause and let that settle. Think about every time you blamed the circumstances. Every time you thought, "I can't because this isn't ready yet." Every time you postponed action, waiting for something external. What if none of that was actually stopping you? What if the only reason you weren't moving was because you hadn't yet changed who you were being in the moment? That is the final, liberating realization. You were never limited. Not by people. Not by money. Not by timing. Not by environment. The only thing that ever held you back was the repeated version of yourself. The identity you maintained, the loops you allowed to run unchecked. And here is the magic. Once you see that, once you fully accept it, you are free. Not free in theory. Not free in the future. Free right now. Because freedom is not external. It's identity-based. It's a reflection of who you are being at this moment. The moment you step into a larger version of yourself, the moment you act as someone capable of more, the moment you interrupt the repeated patterns, life expands immediately. Opportunities appear. Your decisions align with possibility. Your energy shifts. Your results follow. And that is the ultimate loop. The limit was never real, only repeated. Every time you notice hesitation, every time you feel uncertainty, every time you recognize the familiar pattern, you now have a choice: repeat the old loop or step into the new. And each step into the new creates the life that was always waiting. Not somewhere else, not later, but here, now. Take a moment to visualize that. Your life as it could be, free from repeated limitations. Opportunities that once seemed impossible now align. Confidence, clarity, and momentum flow naturally. All because the internal barrier has shifted. This is the power of identity. This is the reason all of these chapters exist. Not to give advice, not to motivate temporarily, but to show you the system, to show you the silent mechanism controlling your life, and how to redesign it intentionally. And now, everything converges. All your past failures, all your old hesitation, all your repeated loops. They are no longer chains. They are data. They are signals. They are lessons showing you where the old identity existed, and where the new one can be built. You see, transformation is not gradual because of external change. It is instant when identity shifts. The moment you act differently, the moment you stop repeating, the moment you step into someone capable of more, the world reflects that shift immediately. And that is the final truth of this audiobook. You were never limited. The limit was never real. It was only repeated. You've traced the loop. You've understood the mechanics of identity. You've felt the discomfort, broken the patterns, upgraded your self-image. And now you see clearly, the power to change your life has always been within you. It is not external. It is internal. It is identity. And the question now is simple. Will you continue repeating, or will you step fully into who you are becoming? In closing, now pause and really take this in, because something fundamental has shifted. Not outside of you, but inside the way you see yourself. For most of your life, you believed you were reacting to reality, responding to circumstances, trying to navigate what was happening around you. But now you see something deeper. You were not reacting to life. You were recreating it. Through patterns, through expectations, through identity. And once you see that, everything changes. Because now when hesitation appears, you don't automatically trust it. When doubt speaks, you don't immediately believe it. When the familiar pulls you back, you recognize it for what it is. A pattern, not a truth. And that awareness is where your freedom begins. Because now you have a choice you didn't have before. To continue the loop, or to break it. Not someday, not when you feel ready, but in the exact moment it tries to repeat. So here is your challenge. The next time you feel yourself about to make the same decision, the same excuse, the same hesitation, pause and ask yourself, is this choice coming from who I've been or who I am becoming? And then, do the unfamiliar thing, the uncomfortable thing, the new thing, because that is the moment your identity shifts. And when your identity shifts, your entire life follows. And the most powerful realization of all is this. You were never stuck. You were never limited. You were never lacking. You were repeating. And now, you're not.